This is the story of Vistara Flight 944. Vistara has been a staple of India's skies for the past decade or so, and as of the 11th of November 2024, Vistara would be merged into the new Air India and would cease to be its own entity. Given that, I thought it would be interesting to look at one of Vistara's closest calls, as we haven't really covered them on the channel yet. The date is the 15th of July 2019. On the ground at Mumbai, India at 9:27 UTC, an Airbus A320 was loaded up with 8,500 kilos of fuel for a quick hop to Delhi, India. The plane first took off and flew all the way to Delhi with no issues. But as they got close to Delhi, they got their first whiff of trouble. The winds were particularly bad that day, with winds at 20 knots gusting up to 30 knots. ATC knew that it would get worse before it got better and told the pilots to expect delays. With the weather so fickle, they decided that they might have to divert. So they started looking at the weather of the airports in their vicinity. But as they were having that conversation, ATC gave them new vectors to set them up for an ILS approach to runway 29 at Delhi. The runway was wet and windy, and this would be a challenging landing. As the pilots fought through the wind and the rain, it looked like they might actually land at Delhi. Then, at just 250 feet off the ground, the wind shifted and the pilots had no choice but to go around. The pilots did not think that the weather in the area of Delhi would improve anytime soon, so they asked ATC for vectors to Lucknow, an airport close to Delhi that is often used as a diversion airport for Delhi. As the jet climbed away from Delhi, the pilots punched in a course that would take them around some nasty weather on the way to Lucknow. They started their descent into Lucknow a bit earlier than usual due to traffic. But here's the problem. The weather at Lucknow had now started to deteriorate as well. The weather system that was hammering Delhi was also starting to mess with Lucknow. The A320 was number 3 in the sequence, and they let the controllers know that they could not take any delays to get into the airport as they were starting to run low on fuel. The controllers were like, yeah, shouldn't be a problem with you getting in on time. But the weather system was practically over the airport at this point. The pilots were now literally in a race against the clock. Would they be able to put this plane down before the weather made a landing impossible? Or would they have to stay airborne on a fuel state that was getting worse by the second? Things were not looking good as the plane in front of them went around due to the weather. 17 miles from the runway, the pilots got the call that they had been dreading. The visibility had dropped all the way from 475 meters to 275 meters. This landing was officially a no-go. They were now, well and truly, for the lack of a better word, screwed. The pilots stayed low to the ground to land as soon as possible once the weather improved. At this point, an amber warning came on the MCDU saying that they were at minimum fuel. The pilots were desperate. They inquired with ATC about the nearest airport to them, which was Kanpur. Kanpur wasn't even listed on the database as being an airport capable of supporting the A320. But any runway is better than an open field, or worse, a densely populated area. They decided to go for Kanpur. But as they started to head for Kanpur, the weather there started to head south. This is when they decided to head for another airport nearby Kanpur called Prayagraj. Here's the problem. They had no idea if they'd be able to make it to Prayagraj with the fuel that they had. Making matters worse, both Kanpur and Prayagraj were not in the plane's database. So they had to use VOR and ADF beacons to get them to these airports. They didn't even have charts to land at these airports. If they did get to these airports, and that's a big if, they would have to fully rely on air traffic control to guide them in. But the pilots of Flight 944 had no other choice. Finally, Flight 944 was thrown a lifeline when the weather at Lucknow started to improve. They now had 500 kilos of fuel on board. At this point, Lucknow was 37 miles away and Prayagraj was 58 miles away. The choice was clear. They headed back to Lucknow. The controllers at Lucknow were briefed on the situation of Flight 944 and they set the plane up for the shortest possible approach to runway 27. The pilots lined the jet up with runway 27, hoping that the fuel would hold out. The jet approached the runway while the pilots kept a watchful eye on the fuel gauge. The jet finally touched down on runway 27 with 348 kilos of fuel on board. That's not a whole lot. So, how does this happen? To understand that, we need to understand how pilots make sure that they have enough fuel for a flight. Well, the amount of fuel that you uplift to the plane is made up of a certain number of factors. You have the taxi fuel, the trip fuel, or the fuel that's used for the actual flying. Then you have the contingency fuel, or the fuel needed to deal with unintended things that come up during the flight. The destination alternate fuel, which is the fuel needed to perform a missed approach at the destination airport, climb to the cruising altitude, and fly the route to the alternate airport, and descent there and land. And then finally, you have the final reserve fuel, which is the minimum fuel that you can land with, legally land with. Well, there are some more factors, but these are the broad strokes. Well, if you've been paying attention, you might be like, well, what happened to Flight 944? It looks like their fuel planning should have taken care of them. Well, the investigators looked at to see if the airlines were forcing pilots to keep the absolute minimum amount of fuel on board to keep costs low. The more fuel you have, the more weight you have to lug around, and that all increases costs. Also, as per Vistara's diversion criteria, you're only supposed to divert to the airports that Vistara doesn't operate to, only if safety is a consideration. This is called an acceptable alternate. Meanwhile, a suitable alternate, according to Vistara, is an airport that is a valid airport that can handle an A320, and an airport where Vistara has some sort of ground assets to handle such a plane. This ambiguity, along with the fuel-saving mantra that is hammered into each pilot, can make the decision to divert a very complex one for a pilot. Quote, "The definitions of alternates therefore create confusion in the mind of the flight crew. While taking a decision on where to divert, particularly the clause of saving fuel, is deeply imbibed in the mind of flight crew these days. The decision-making during a high-stress situation may result in unsafe situations." End quote. So what else contributed to this accident? Well, there's the small discrepancy between the transit briefing sheet and the computerized flight plan. You see, the transit briefing sheet, a sheet with data given to the crew with alternates and all that stuff, had Ahmedabad and Lucknow listed as the alternate, which are both airports where the airline flies to and therefore has ground infrastructure in place ready to go in case of a diversion. But on the computerized flight plan that the crew punched into the computers of the plane, the alternates were listed as Lucknow and Jaipur. There's only one problem with this. With the amount of fuel that they had on board, they would barely be able to make it to Ahmedabad in case of a diversion. To make it to Ahmedabad, they would not be able to hold over Delhi even for a little bit. You see the problem here, right? On one hand, the airline is like, hey, consider the airport where we have ground handling infrastructure as your first preference for a diversion, because that makes our life easier. But then, at the same time, the airline is comfortable with pilots putting in an airport where they don't have ground infrastructure, in this case, Jaipur, as the alternate because Jaipur is closer to Delhi. And that means that they can load less fuel onto the plane, meaning lower costs when you don't have to divert. You see how this diversion thing is a huge mess of a decision, right? Then, when they held over Delhi for a bit, that automatically meant that they would never be able to make it to Ahmedabad with the fuel that they had on board. Then, the pilots waited till their only option was Lucknow. The pilots weren't willing to go to Jaipur as the airline really didn't want them to go there. After all of this, they went around to Delhi, and when they finally updated themselves about the weather at Lucknow, we all know what happened. But the pilot in command of this plane was focused on getting this plane to Lucknow no matter what. While they were on their way to Jaipur, ATC said, and I quote, "Any interest for Jaipur, sir? Jaipur is vacant," end quote. This was ATC's way of going, are you sure you want to divert to an airport whose weather might be unviable by the time you get there? Which was a good question to ask because Jaipur was closer. But the pilots had made up their minds and they were going to Lucknow. What's interesting is that the pilot did not mention this offer from ATC in his statement. Make of that what you will. Then, once the weather at Lucknow had improved, ATC had to tell the pilots to land at Lucknow because they felt that the pilots might not have done it themselves. The word that the report uses is prompted, and it's in bold because the report wants to make it clear who made the decision here. Well, there's one final last line of defense that the pilots had, and that was the flight dispatcher. You see, once the plane is airborne, the dispatcher is supposed to keep an eye on the plane and keep the pilots up to date of all the weather information in their path. In this case, the dispatcher should have sent a satellite image of the area and went, you know what? Lucknow looks bad. Don't divert there. But that never happened. So this incident was a failure on so many levels. Now, I almost didn't make this video because I got to this point in the script and I was like, wait, I've made this entire video before. So I went into my archives and to my shock, I've made 2 videos on the exact same topic. Think about it, twice. Same airport, same region, same issues on multiple airlines at 2 different times. So that begs the question, is flying in India safe? I've flown in this airspace. I have family members who have flown in this airspace. So is it just a matter of time before something goes so wrong that it ends in a crash? Is this just an issue around Delhi, or is this an issue around India's major airports? The number of people flying in India is skyrocketing, but is its infrastructure keeping up? All of these are questions that only time can answer. But in the meantime, I'd love to hear your thoughts below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.